He didn't sit down with the head of Panama to discuss the canal or the head of Denmark to discuss. He announced, and he's made a career out of being a naughty boy. And the working class loves it because they felt abandoned, which they had been. The Democrats are as responsible for Mr. Trump as anybody else. And Mr. Trump won because he managed this symbolism very well. I am naughty. I am not of that establishment. I hate them like you do.
We last spoke on the show a few months ago, just before the 2024 election. And at the time, the crucial word you used to describe Donald Trump was irrelevant. And I believe, you should correct me if I'm mistaken, that the point there was that he was just going to be some sort of blip in history. And I'm wondering if now, in 2025, you're still feeling that he's irrelevant.
Yep, I am. I don't think that, I don't think he has a clue. I'm mostly amazed by the collection of people he has brought with him, because I wait for somebody in that group, and that may still emerge, but I wait for somebody who seems to me at least to have a sense of a strategic perspective that understands the basic problems and comes up with a plan of how to deal with them. I'm not expecting a plan that's foolproof, a plan that can't fail, and nothing like that, but just a kind of coherent assessment of what the problems are, connected to a coherent plan. But the economic problems faced by the United States now are incredible in their multiplicity, in their seriousness, in how many of the problems have not been addressed for a long time. But I don't see, other than verbiage, verbiage has had a sort of an explosion of verbiage, but I don't see it. So I don't think whatever he does is going to make much of a difference to what's going on. Here and there it will have impact, horrible in some cases, perhaps beneficial in others, but as a comprehensive assessment of the problem and a strategy, no, I don't see it. And so my conclusion is that the hodgepodge of policies, that's what it is, a hodgepodge of mutually contradictory, weird proposals that are much more two things: continuations of what worked for him as a candidate, plus doubling down on where he got himself into trouble. It seems to, if I can discern a strategy, that's it. What worked to get me in should work to keep me going. Big mistake. And doubling down where I didn't succeed before, or where I've been got pushback, doesn't strike me as a brilliant move either. It's a kind of mechanical response to somebody who hopes that this approach will somehow work. People have been asking me, and the image I like is Donald Trump was told that there is this thing in football called a Hail Mary pass. That's when the quarterback in a tough situation just leans back and heaves the ball downfield as far as possible, tells his confederates on the team, those that are responsible, go into this direction, go to the left corner, let's hope where the ball comes down or where it bounces into you. And sometimes that works. Is it possible that what Mr. Trump does will actually produce the outcome he tells us it will? Sure, it's not a zero possibility. But then we don't miss Mr. Trump, because that's almost true for anybody. It certainly would have been true for Mr. Biden or Kamala Harris or anybody else. It's not a coherent, and I'd be glad to explain how and why that is, but it's a strange amalgam of contradictions And the only reason I have to say that is because the media in this country want to give him, as a new president or a returned president, the benefit of the doubt, or maybe some leeway, or the first 100 days. And so they don't do what they should do. I think that will change as the impacts of what he does become clearer, but for the moment, no.
You said a lot of things that I want to get back to, such as this hodgepodge of strategies and his cabinet picks. But stepping back for a moment, one of the things that I've really come to enjoy doing on the show, even though many listeners seem to hate it, is discuss both sides of an issue. And so my last interview was with Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution, and we talked about Trump and the election and what to expect going forward, and that's one of the topics that you and I are going to discuss. Before I tell you some of the things he thought, which I expect you might disagree with,
I would hope so.
I am curious to hear why you think, after the fact now, Trump won the election and Harris lost.
Harris made a strategic choice to be the continuation of Joe Biden. I understand what many of the considerations were that led her to make that decision. And when I say her, I mean the entourage around her that helps her make strategic decisions, which all candidates have. And I think, if I had to pick a single thing, what the American people want is change. An awful lot of them want change. And Mr. Trump, not by the programs he comes up with so much, but the bluster, the bullying, the over-the-top language, the endless symbolism. And so Kamala Harris undercuts this by insisting, under pressure, that she is the continuation of Joseph Biden. That was a mistake. Biden was nothing. Biden was same old, same old. And by that I don't mean Democrat. It's like George Bush or Clinton or Obama. It's what a majority of Americans, in different ways and for different reasons, they don't want more of that. They want something else. And I think, in a country like ours, which has its Cold War legacy, which I would define as follows: a liberal consensus on both sides, moderate Republicans and the usual Democrats, moving steadily to the right, both of them, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, in a program I would call the undoing of the New Deal, which they did together. What the lesson was to the mass of people is there is an establishment. We have Tweedledum and Tweedledee. We oscillate between the Republican and the Democrat. Nothing much changes. And if you do want to change, the only allowable place is to go to the right, because the left was anathema. The left was evil. We had a purge of people on the left after World War II. Very serious. We didn't have a comparable purge of people on the right. American people were taught there's really two options: this consensus and the right. You see that in many European countries too. You've developed it. They copied the United States. You've developed this core middle. But if people don't want the middle anymore and begin to ask themselves, what else is there? What they've had, what has been available, is the right-wing alternative, so they go there. If you develop a serious left-wing alternative, then you're going to see, which is going to shock people, but it shouldn't, you're going to see that a good percentage of those who went to the right will go to the left, because that alternative is more attractive to them. And the best example we see right now is France. The people in France who are in power, the big bloc in the assembly, majority bloc, no, that's wrong, plurality blocs, it's not a majority, is the left. It put four parties together, ran them as a unified party, and ends up the largest bloc in the assembly, to the shock and the end of Mr. Macron's career, for sure, etc. And there's no reason to believe that that's unique to France. You see a right wing in France, to show the point, but it's not big enough. The left wing is bigger. Nobody should be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened here. But for that to happen, there has to be one of the things that was foreclosed in this country, which is a left wing, because it was rendered the evil communist other for so long that nobody has had yet the key to bring the existing left into a position where it could be an alternative change from the consensus. So Mr. Trump sits there all alone. Another way to understand it, which is consistent, is to see that in the second part of the undoing of the New Deal, the Democratic Party succeeded in attracting the support and the money of a large number of American megacorporations. They had always favored the Republicans. They still do. If you look at where the money goes, it's very clear. But the Democrats were able to get Silicon Valley portion of them and others. And that was an existential threat to the Republicans. Because if the Democrats can continue to get the unions, the women, the minorities, a disproportionate number of working class people, and they get the money, the Republicans are done. What they can get, given their history, the Christian conservatives, the white supremacists, and so on, they're dead. They lose, and they did one election after another. So they made the decision, or rather Trump did, people around him, okay, if an end run of the Democrats was to get some of our supporters the money, we've got to do a comparable end run around them, which we will. We'll start talking to the working class. We'll outdo the Democrats with the working class the way they have outdone us with the financial supports we used to count on to be a viable political operation. And that's what happened. Mr. Trump talks, going to bring back jobs here, and he's going to get rid of those awful immigrants that contest and destroy.
And eat pets.
Yes, that too. That's right. I forgot. It's already several months old. But no, look at the symbolism. He has an airplane in which he has a hapless group of apparently Colombian immigrants here, puts them in shackles. Their crimes, they're immigrants, which in most parts of the world is not a crime. It's not even clear it's a crime here. That would have to be determined unless the old premise of innocent until guilty has been absorbed too. And he dumps them on a runway at an airport in Colombia. I mean, what? You didn't sit down with the Colombians to work? You just dumped them on? And the answer is yes. He didn't sit down with the head of Panama to discuss the canal, or the head of Denmark to discuss. He announced, this is naughty boy. This is naughty boy. And he's made a career out of being a naughty boy. He's upset that he's treated like a naughty boy and then acts like a naughty boy, which is not all that unusual among naughty boys. So that's what we have symbolically. And the working class loves it because they felt abandoned, which they had been. The Democrats are as responsible for Mr. Trump as anybody else. And it should be understood for the historical moment that it is. And I think Mr. Trump won because he managed this symbolism very well. I am naughty. I am not of that establishment. I hate them like you do. They have abused me personally, just like you. And Kamala Harris can't. She would have had to develop a different persona, a different projection. She didn't do that. I'm not privy, so I don't know what her calculations were, but I think they were wrong. I think she lost the election, not because Mr. Trump became more popular, but because her side became less so. And so the vote, the fewer voters, blah, blah. And he was able to make inroads among young voters and black voters, more than enough. And he only won by 1.5% of the vote. He has to create the mandate verbally because he doesn't have it in reality. But with him, you never quite know whether he grasps the boundary between the fantasy and the BS and the reality, or whether he really thinks, as other presidents have, that he can now create the reality. It conveniently conforms to how he would like it to be. A lot of people make that mistake.
Before we return to this narrative of change, which I find very compelling, and I guess it might actually be involved in this conversation, in this coming question, and also Victor Davis Hanson, who I just mentioned. You referred to unions, and in our last conversation, you anticipated that the unions would be in support of Biden. And I wanted to ask why then, for instance, a union like the Longshoremen's Union ended up going for Trump.
Well, the unions have been on decline in this country. If you look at membership, which is not the only measure, but it's an important measure, they've been on decline for half a century. I mean, that has put them in an impossible situation. Their traditions in this country had to do with servicing your members, filing grievances, representing your workers with the employer, getting better wages, working conditions. And that takes time and energy and staff. And the only way you pay for that is if you have members who pay dues. So if you're losing your membership for 50 years, and the line is literally, a little blips, but it's basically a line of 50-year decline. I believe their peak was in 1955 or around there, and it's been downhill ever since. In the private sector, which is the major part of our economy, union membership is 7% or less of the labor force. That means 93% of private employees are not represented by a union. Well, the unions are bankrupt then. They don't have them. Where are they going to get the money to sustain the staff which could provide the services that could sustain the union? When you put that together with the post-Depression rollback of the New Deal, remember, 1947 is crucial. It's the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, whose provisions most people don't know, but you really ought to go back if you're interested and look at them. There are things such as, if you're a communist, you can't be a leader of a union. Well, hello, friends. Communists are the people who usually lead unions and do so in a militant way. Who else would you expect? Communists with a small c, whether or not they're members of a communist party. And even bigger than the Taft-Hartley Act said, anything won by a union at a workplace, any wage increase, any working in condition improvement, has to be given to everybody working there, whether they joined the union and pay dues or not. What? And by the way, not just shame on the employer class for having come together to support these bills, which is why they passed, but also the unions themselves. Did they not understand what this would do to them? Did it take 50 years of observing the results? The answer is they accommodated to the conditions they faced. And those conditions were a society that had gone through a trauma, the collapse of its own capitalist system in the Great Depression, and the decision of the employer class that what had happened there must never be allowed to happen again. What happened there was a mass of people cut an alliance with Mr. Roosevelt, and got their Social Security. We talked about this last time. And all of that Social Security, unemployment compensation, the 10 million or 12 million workers hired by the government, all of the money for that was taken from the rich, the corporations and the rich, whose taxes were raised and who were required to loan what they didn't pay in taxes. Okay, they don't want that to ever happen. And they went to work with a kind of unanimity and a kind of commitment that comes out of being frightened, badly frightened by what they observed. This is hard to get across to Americans, but what for those people they observed was the equivalent of what Europeans observed with Nazis marching through their streets. A shock, a horror for many, and a shifting of the way you think about the world and yourself in it. And they made a decision, very impressive, and they carried it through. They demonized the left. Look, many of the people hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee, believe it or not, that's what it was called. Not my language. They chose an Un-American Activities Committee. They were going to decide what's American and what isn't, and they were going to punish, imprison, deport, all kinds of things they did with those who were deemed un-American. They went after the coalition that produced the New Deal. It was a coalition of the Democratic Party, Mr. President Roosevelt, the Union movement, which he encouraged, led by the CIO, which was then the dominant union experience, and there's two socialists and one communist party. That was the New Deal coalition. People interested in civil rights, women wanting the end of sexism, found their places within those institutions. Socialist Party, Communist Party, Labor Movement. And that had to be smashed to bits. And they went systematically. What was the weakest link of that coalition? The Communist Party, because that could be linked to the great new enemy, our former ally. But you had to develop a theater. And that theater shaped the American political consciousness. I remember when my son was of an age to go to college, one of the places he wanted to look at was the University of Chicago. So I packed him up and we went to Chicago so that my son could go around. And they had a little program like they usually do for prospective students, and there was an existing student who took us around, showed us the campus. And at one point my son, because it's my son, said, well, are there political groups? Asking with all the open honesty and naivete that a 17-year-old would have. And the young man who was taking us around, it was very nice and very helpful, said, yes, we have everything from the, then he mentioned a right-wing, Young Americans for Freedom, right-wing, all the way over to the Democratic Party. And for him, and for everybody else, that was it. That was politics. There was nothing further left. Or, same way of saying it, further left takes you out of the conversation into the area of scary, dangerous, evil. Oh, for that. And the young man in the University of Chicago, very American, had absorbed that without understanding what he was doing. He absorbed it. The whole country is that. And that's why when this era of capitalism is over, as I believe it to be, and the dominant position in the United States is over, as I believe it to be, and you turn in with the horror of that, the fear of what that means, well, then you go to the right because that's the alternative to what you have had all along, and you feel the need for a break. Mr. Trump plays that theme endlessly. I'm new, I'm different, I'm with the verbiage and the hyper, 400 presidential orders, each having to reverse them the next morning, didn't think it through. Look at this, it's a spectacle. but it's a spectacle that has its real roots.
Again, I'm just keeping track of all the things we're going to be coming back to. I assume that a big portion of our conversation will be about the end of the American empire and where we are with Trump right now. But now I would like to take this narrative you've given about the election being explained by a desire for change and the inability of Harris and the Democratic Party to provide that. I'd like to connect that to what Victor Davis Hanson said and see if you see any resonance between the two ideas. The way that Victor accounted for the election is he sees it, I think, as part of a larger culture war between, on the one hand, what he referred to as the bi-coastal left-wing intellectual elite, and then on the other side, a more common folk that is simply competence-minded and down-to-earth and cares about skills and success and doesn't care about Ivy League degrees.
And has spokespeople like Mr. Hanson.
And has spokespeople like Mr. He is a farmer.
Yes, what he is.
He is. So, on the one hand...
Too. I have 4 tomato plants. Yeah, go ahead.
On the one hand, I see this as connecting to your idea of change as well, because presumably the right wants change from this obsolete left ruling class. But I wonder if you see a similar culture war afoot.
No, I see people like him really trying and stretching to construct such an idea. But in my view, that's because it doesn't work. And they're worried about where all this might go. And this is for them, a much happier story than the one I tell. They don't want to deal with a declining empire. They don't want to deal with a capitalism that doesn't work. They want this to be all in the realm of the bad people on the coasts with their evil elitism versus the men and women of the soil. This game has been played by left-wingers too. This is a very old way of thinking. He may not know it, but I could give him references if he wants about where this game has been played before. I don't think the elites, whatever that quite means, on the coast have the power or the understanding to play the nice role of bad guy that his construct assigns to them. And, I understand what he's doing. It's all over the place. I'm sure he didn't claim he was the origin of this insight. He repeats it. And for me, it's empty. Even if you believed it, you'd have to then explain, why do we have people on the coast who do what they do, say what they say, advocate what... You'd have to explain it. But is there something in the air in California and New York that make them attract? I mean, stop. What is this? And it becomes dangerous, because if it... In the hands of people less scrupulous than I hope Mr. Hanson is, this can become, a rural against urban, an educated against uneducated. That's where this goes, in the hands of many. And he will bear responsibility, because giving a veneer of respectability to this way of thinking is cheap in the end. No, I like to ground what I'm saying in what's actually happening in the economic realities of the United States. There are certain industries that are still viable in the United States. Many industries aren't. Why not? Because capitalists who make these decisions made the decision to relocate their businesses overseas. Or those same capitalists made the decision to automate. Okay, so a whole lot of industries left, and much of the unhappiness of the people in the middle of the country is because that's what they left from. Whereas the industries that still can function for all kinds of reasons because they're service industries. You can't have a service industry in China serving people in America, because the industry has to be where the people are, otherwise it doesn't work. So we exported manufacturing, we didn't export services, with some exceptions. The industries that are still viable here, high tech, they went to California for all kinds of reasons long ago. So they can expand, they can hire more. Everybody can go live, in San Jose or in the environment. But that's not because, however lovely California's climate, it's because these are industries that are still viable as leadership industries in world capitalism located here. That leadership, by the way, is leaching away. Last week, we all got a lesson when DeepSeek showed us what can be done by those nasty Chinese folks in the way of the high-tech AI revolution. It's not going to be dominated by the United States. That's what the lesson is. But we're going to watch. What is the story the Hansons of this world are going to tell us about China's arrival? They're going to tell us, sadly, that the Chinese copied a lot of the United States, which is true but irrelevant. The newcomer always copies the old one. When the United States broke from Britain, you know what the Britain charged the United States with for the whole 19th century? Stealing our technology, which had its grain of truth. It always does. But this sudden, they're stealing. This is, how awful. What you're really revealing is you don't know anything about your own history. What are you doing? It becomes cheap, and it slides into, well, I'll leave that to the audience to figure out where that stuff slides to. So I understand the effort to make this a culture war is, in my judgment, an attempt to distract attention from other dimensions which not only explain the story better, but help us understand why that culture war even exists. What is its origin, its cause? Otherwise, you start with a culture war. What is that? How are you going to ground that? And by the way, I don't understand something. That kind of argument then becomes grounded in stories of education. The political complexity of the United States that I've been talking about was not significantly different from the political orientation of my classmates at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. So that's supposedly the elite. But they were as clueless about the left wing as most Americans were, because they were affected by the same culture war against the left that came out of World War II. The most famous economics professor at Harvard at my time was a man who with a big reputation named Joseph Schumpeter. You may have heard his name. Joseph Schumpeter had a prize student at Harvard named Paul Sweezy.
I was hoping you'd say Rick Wolff.
No, Paul Sweezy. They're older than I was young, just arriving there. Paul Sweezy who himself was a graduate of Harvard, who was a member of the Rockefeller family, the right one. And so he grew perfect. He's at Harvard getting his degree, comes from the wealthy, and he's the heir apparent to Joseph Schumpeter. At the end of the 1940s, Harvard fires him. He's teaching already. They fire him. They're not going to let him replace Schumpeter, as Schumpeter wanted. No. Why? Because he had become a Marxist in the 1930s, as so many had. And Harvard, under the gun and the pressure, had no more backbone then than it has had recently with its other leaders that it dumped when the wind politically changed. And where did Sweezy go? He left Harvard and went to New York City and founded a magazine called the Monthly Review, which still exists, using money given to him by Albert Einstein, who wrote the editorial in the first issue of Monthly Review, which was entitled Why I Am a Socialist. All of that, that's the culture war. But for people to think that the culture war didn't come out of the history of this, they're very bizarre. Very bizarre. So I don't, as a proposition, I don't take it serious. As an interesting phenomena of how you avoid, this is the continuation of the taboo on the Marxist or the leftist way of opening up a question. It's an approach that will not debate. In Europe, it's quite different. There, the right has to debate the left. It's too hard. They can't just dismiss it. They try. In good American copying, try to do, because they envy what the United States can do to its working class, because you can't do it there. Right? Europeans have a national health service. Europe doesn't allow the death penalty. European universities are mostly free. You can't do to the working class there, and their capitalists are envious. But other than that, the culture war stuff cannot be pursued there the way it is here, because it doesn't have this history.
You mentioned, as an economist, you tend to support a lot of your arguments with reference to economics.
Absolutely.
Right, and Victor's background, at least in part, is farming, so it was natural for us to talk about the California wildfire disaster, because he could at length explain exactly what's going on with California's water. But the way that he accounted for this situation, and I bring it up just because it's still quite topical, is that you have a situation where the government is at the hands of this bi-coastal, in this case, west coastal elite, and they're ideologically captured and incompetent, and their mismanagement is what led to this tremendous disaster, or at least seriously contributed to it. Whereas if you had people closer to the soil or closer to the water in charge, this disaster would not have expanded to the proportions it has taken up.
But this is simple-mindedness. What is this as an analysis? Bad people made bad decisions. Yeah, but why are those bad people in a position to do that? And why did they make the bad decisions? What? Where's it? What kind of an analysis? This is not analysis. This is saying there's something really bad happened, and I'm going to tell you who's responsible. Okay. Can we get beyond that? Could you? Okay, well, you pointed at Jack, or at, what is it, the elite. Well, how did they get to be the elite? Who didn't get there? Why did that happen? Come on, this is not an analysis. This is substitute. You don't need an analysis, you got the bad guy. I don't have to understand why any of this happened. I got the bad. By the way, that's our criminal justice system. Well, we get the bad guy and we put him in jail. See? Yeah, Jack. You know what the recidivism rate in the country is? That guy in jail is going to come out. And you know what jail is going to do? Make him worse. You're not solving any problem. Has jail solved our crime problem? We're a crime-ridden society. Everybody has a gun. That was supposed to solve the problem. Didn't. What are you doing? That Mr. Hansen can sit, and again, I don't know him, and I bear him no ill will, but to sit and talk like this, doesn't he feel the need? If he's going to make the bad guy be people in California who have been incompetent. Really? You think incompetence is all on one side of the ledger here? And if they are incompetent, how come they're in this position to do these things as such big incompetence? I mean, the questions that this kind of line of thinking opens up that are not admitted or addressed ought to make you wonder, wow. And again, I'm getting closer to taking offense, because there are ugly versions of this. which are racism. That also pins a whole lot of associations on some group. Oh, what? I noticed Mr. Trump said that the problem with immigrants is they do crime. And then his own FBI had to release the statistics that the crime rate among undocumented immigrants is lower than the crime rate among natives, which would have been the reasonable presumption anyway. Why? Because if you're an undocumented immigrant, you want to keep as far away from the police as, I mean, come on. My parents were immigrants. I'm also personally affected by this. And this, by the way, Mr. Hansen knows that this country has a history, serious history, of racism, of blaming people, of bad-mouthing every immigrant wave that came here. The English did it to the Irish did it to the Italian. I could go on. And we all know that. We really do. We invented the melting pot because we were so upset by what the reality was. Okay. It still is in large parts of the country. So, what are you doing? The culture war means you're inventing yet another what? There's something, these people who live in California they're incompetent. Oh, what is racism? Those dark-skinned people, they're not, they're like children. Should I rehash our American South? This is a dangerous way of thinking. I don't think he means it. My suspicion is, like most of people like that, he's ignorant of this country's history. Because if he weren't, he'd be much more hesitant about talking like this, knowing where it comes from and where it might go. It doesn't need some nice close-to-the-soil farmer to give it validity. It's very dangerous.
I do think that Victor is a very careful thinker, and he's not here, so
yes, for sure.
I can't speak for him, but when I next speak with him, I will certainly raise some of these points to get his opinions.
That's what if I were in a room with him.
Right, of course. But before we move on, I am curious to hear, I assume, I know that you're somebody who likes to hear both sides of an issue, who likes to think about things carefully.
I want to learn.
Are there any right-wing thinkers out there today, or political pundits or commentators, who you do find to be genuinely insightful and interesting?
I don't know what generally quite means.
Genuinely.
I don't know what it means. And I'm no judge of how genuine they are. But the guy who used to be on Fox News and then was kicked off. And
Tucker Carlson?
Yeah, for example. I think sometimes he's very good.
Really?
Yeah.
You like Tucker? Well, might be a strong word.
No, that's why I said genuine, and how genuinely, I don't know. But I find it interesting that he sometimes is able to do a piece of analysis very close to my own, from which I have learned. So, he does it in his way. It's not quite the way I do it. But he alerts me to a relationship that I didn't give that much weight to. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful to anybody who teaches me. So he has on occasion taught me. Other times he says things that I find laughable and of no interest, other than the pathology of this kind of thinking. That's why I don't know about genuine or general. But he's one from whom I have learned. And when I play with the internet and I come across, I usually stop and listen and try to see how they construct. For example, these days I'm very interested in people whose work I have occasionally learned from, as they, in my judgment, slavishly admire Trump in a kind of lopsided enthusiasm that they don't normally show to anything, including ideas and personalities on the right. But for Mr. Trump, they have really almost an adoration that makes them stop being as critical as I know they have been in other circumstances. I assume that will fade after a while, maybe not. But I have always made sure to look at that point of view, to listen to it. I do that I'm interested in Europe particularly, so I've paid attention to the right-wing Marine Le Pen. I read her work sometimes, her statements. In Germany, for Deutschland, you may remember I read French and German, so those things are accessible to me. And I make sure to, when there's a character who comes to my attention, Viktor Orban in Hungary. Mostly, though, the leaders of these countries they're not very, it's not an impressive group, put it that way. There are some exceptions, but not many. And among the contending politicals, the most sophisticated discussion are the French and German, as far as I can tell. I mean, to take seriously Mr. Starmer in England is an effort. I mean, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. I don't want to be unfair. I mean, it's no more or less than Mr. Biden.
Something I find funny is that the one reason I asked you about right-wing thinkers is I'm always looking for new and interesting guests, and I thought you might mention somebody I hadn't heard of, but you mentioned Tucker Carlson, which is funny to interpret that. Obviously, this wasn't your intention as an invitation to have Tucker Carlson on the show.
Yeah.
But
he doesn't need exposure. He doesn't need opportunity because he writes his own.
Now, I'd like to ask just two more questions about the election before we move on from the election. And these are things that have come to mind as you've been speaking. I remember that your wife is a therapist.
Yes.
And I also know that you have some interest in psychoanalysis.
Yes.
And you have mentioned a couple of times in this conversation that involved in Trump and his policies is this hodgepodge of contradictions. And what this makes me wonder is whether you think that there's something that psychoanalysis as a form of cultural analysis might tell us about the election. Is there something going on in America's subconscious that led people to vote for Trump? Some sort of contradictory impulses?
Sure. And the reason I focus on economics is not that I'm an economist. I'm an economist because I became fascinated by the economic dimension of things. So I would like to say that it's not, the old joke, if you're a carpenter, then everything looks like a nail. It's not that. It's that the economics, and I can tell you just for myself, as I went through, when I arrived as a freshman in college, I wanted to be a biochemist. That was my intention. I had been a science kind of person in high school, and I wanted to be, and my first semester was all math, physics, chemistry, second semester biology. So here I am an economist. I obviously didn't do that. I didn't make that my career. And that's because I discovered that the questions I had about the economic system, which came out of my life, my family, my conversation, particularly with my father, and so on, and that those questions were never answered by the teachers, that I would say. And I think I mentioned this to you before, that those teachers either didn't know the answer, which was often the case, or they did, and either told me rarely or showed me more often that they really didn't want me to pursue this in the class with my hand up. I was a good student, I got all A's, and blah, blah. My parents made sure of that. So I had, the teachers were friendly to me. There wasn't oppositional. A couple of exceptions, but not many. They were afraid. And I think the fear in their eyes, which I pursued by going to their offices and just sitting one-on-one with them, where they told me what they were. I realized I was right. I saw fear. And they told me, well, that they were afraid. They didn't want this. They wouldn't mind talking with me in their office. And then they basically explained to me what I verified later anyway, that, and this is Harvard, so you might think it wasn't, you'd be wrong. It was not good for your career. Because they were concerned. They don't know how a conversation in which I ask questions dealing with Marxism and they answer them would lead students to begin to say, well, I'm not teaching, without meaning the teacher any harm, but the students would chit-chat and all that. And they were afraid. And I think my interest combined with their unwillingness or incapacity to answer them drew me into it. If you ask me, why do I focus on economics? Because the environment in which I was educated couldn't handle it. It was a taboo. You know? It's like saying to someone, why are you interested in sex? If they're honest, they'll tell you, whatever the manifold reasons might be. One of the reasons is a big taboo. And when they ask questions, Aunt Louise freaked out, or their father told them to go talk to the mother, and vice versa. We all know this. And that's part of why we're interested in sex, because it has been handled in the bizarre ways that our culture does that. I'm interested in economics because I think it helps explain things, but much more important, it's the missing thing in the explanations. Otherwise, we're stuck with work at the level of your representation. I want to hold Mr. Hansen, but the way you represented it, which I assume is the perfectly reasonable way of doing it, that I don't want to work at that level. That's for me, that's not serious stuff. And by the way, Tucker Carlson sometimes really goes after the economics. And you can see that even today. What did I see today? Oh yeah, coming here in the taxi, there was a little ad, a political ad. The slogan was, bust big pharma. Okay. I found that interesting. I am agreeing with that. I would like to bust big pharma too. But I'm surprised that somebody raised the money to do this sort of thing. Okay, that's sort of interesting. And I have noticed in some right-wing pieces I've read an immense hostility to big pharma. A hostility which the right wing didn't used to do, but it's doing it now.
Yeah.
What's that? That's an allowable area. Yet, to watch the inauguration of Mr. Trump and to see immediately in the front row the people sitting behind him, the billionaires of our time, not the governors, not the Supreme Court justice, who is the celebrate? And their achievement is they have a lot of money. And they're going to be with this president. He wants them there. That's why they're there. They want to be there, and he wants them there. This is very interesting. And so he can go after Big Pharma. They don't stop him. They carefully avoid going there. But Big Pharma is not that far from big high tech, which is what's coming next anyway. And we'll see how Mr. Trump deals with it.
Since economics is, naturally it keeps coming up. The last thing I wanted to ask about this election specifically is whether you also account, beyond this large-scale change narrative for the outcome of the election, with an appeal to economic factors. Like, I know inflation, for instance, plagued Biden for a very long time. But are there other economic factors that you think really contributed to Trump's victory?
Oh, sure. My goodness, yeah. I don't think inflation. I mean, inflation played a role, but it shouldn't be yanked out of the context of everything else. The job prospects for millions of young people in this country are awful. There aren't jobs. I mean, even in my field, my students, people that I sit on doctoral committees, and I have to examine the student, and I have to make a decision whether he or she gets their PhD or not, whether this dissertation is acceptable. The students that it's harder and harder for them to get decent jobs. If I had time, I'd give you a lecture, but the catastrophe of higher education in this country. When I went to graduate school, I never questioned. Of course I'd get a job being a professor. That's what people with PhDs from fancy universities could get if they wanted it. I might not get the job of my dreams, be professor at this school, sure, but that I would have a problem having an income, and it never dawned on me. And that's not because of me. It didn't dawn on my fellow students either. We never talked about it. We never worried about it. No, not at all. Zero. My students obsess about it. That's a radical difference. And most of my students cannot get the kind of job I have. All of my adult life, I taught 2 courses a semester, 2 semesters a year, and got paid a salary that I could have a wife, which I had, and 2 children, which I had, still have, and I never thought about it. And I enjoy good food and wine. I like to travel. I have tastes that cost money, and I always had enough money. I'm not super rich, but that's all gone. My students worry how they'll live in terms of income, what kind of work they will be able to get. Many of them are adjunct professors who teach a course over here, then they run across town teaching. There's no time to write. There's no time to do research. There's barely enough time to kind of keep up with, which, by the way, is a diminution of our education system. Serious. It means large numbers of young people are being educated by folks that are exhausted. I wasn't exhausted. I had time to read and prepare my lectures. Very precious to me. I learned, as any teacher who's honest will tell you, you learn much more when you're a teacher than you ever did when you were a student. I had that opportunity. Most of the people like me don't have that opportunity anymore. So that's a very serious problem. It's only for 2 or 3 million people that are the folks who teach in colleges and universities. But that's not an unimportant part of the economy. I would argue it's spectacularly important. I don't know if you're aware or if your audience is, but we have more and more colleges and universities that are closing every month. Why? Because their economics is impossible, right? They can't get the students because the students are increasingly unwilling to load up with the debt without which you can't go to college anymore. It wasn't my case. Most of my fellow students didn't. I did. I had to borrow because my family had no money. But most of the students around me didn't. Their families had enough money to pay. Mine didn't, but I never worried about it. I didn't have to borrow that much, and I knew I would have a job which would allow me to pay off my debt, which is exactly what happened to me. I expected it. I got it. That's all gone now. That's all gone. China is opening a new university once a month.
Wow. That's a big, stark difference.
Yeah, a very stark difference. And you want to know, I don't know if you know the DeepSeek story. That's a little entrepreneur.
Could you tell it, for our
Sure. DeepSeek has come up with a better way of moving the artificial intelligence revolution forward. And it exploded into the public awareness in the middle of January, or the second half of January of this year, 2025. And the breakthrough came in a small company owned and started by an entrepreneur who's the CEO of the little company called DeepSeek, with the S capitalized. So it's the word deep and then capital Seek. And he explains that he hired new graduates of some of the new technical universities in China. He doesn't say, but clearly the message is they're fresh, they're new, and they're cheap. Because one of the things that he came up with was a competitor product. Basically, think of it as a search engine for how to go through vast amounts of data super quick to come up with what AI can do, which is a paragraph or a paper or an analysis. It's crude, but it does a lot of the preliminary research that anybody has to do in any field. It's being used now, for example, to do diagnosis. You feed into this machine the 27 characteristics of a patient who comes with a pain or something, and you get better diagnoses because basically you can mine the history of those symptoms and see, when they all occur together, what the three most likely diseases, and that just saves an enormous amount. It's very helpful, and they have comparable applications in many other fields. I use it myself. I've begun to use it recently. Yeah, you can have an idea of a relationship in economics between an interest rate and exports, and you say, what is the relationship between it? And the machine gives you an answer. Now, there are holes in it, there are mistakes in it, but it gives you a very nice place to start. Then you fix the holes and you correct the errors. It's as if you had a very good graduate student and said, go get me everything on this, which is what, I've been in that position. I told the graduate, go get me this, right? And you very quickly discover who's the better graduate student. Who isn't? Because one of them comes back in 2 days with a wonderful, and the other one comes back in 2 days and says, how do I do this?
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's a small company, and for a tiny fraction, I believe $5 or $6 million, they have done something that is the equivalent of what costs billions in Silicon Valley. And, the stock market, the biggest company in the United States on the stock market recently was a company called NVIDIA. You may have heard of it. It lost $600 billion, let me do it again, $600 billion of value in one day.
Wow.
And this was publicized. Turned out the publicity was that over the last weekend, and it really was this last weekend, more people downloaded that program, which by the way is available for free from this little company, than anything else in the whole Apple system. Apple app, they bought it from the App Store. So everyone in America, I now know 20 people that are using it. That's how fast all these things go. They're not using the ones from California. They're using that one. Because for them, California is still producing these things. There will be company. It's not over. The one in China has flaws also. It's not that. It's just another sign, if you needed it, where the competition is coming. And since that's the remaining dynamic industry of the United States, to see it there, wow. Before, and I will be using that example now to make my arguments. Before, and I believe the last time you and I spoke, the example was electric vehicles. That was where the Chinese, but that's an old industry, the automobile industry. AI is the newest of the new explosive industries, and the Chinese are right there, neck and neck, doing it. It's just, and then when you hear He's taking advantage of all the universities opening up. I think the American economy is in terrible difficulty. And that the crisis of our time, which includes Mr. Trump, is that the response is denial. Self-delusional denial, which is not surprising. I have a certain compassion for it. It's hard to be alive at a time when your empire is dying. It's hard if your economic system is full of problems. It really is.
That conversation we had about the electric vehicles was a couple of episodes ago, and we're reaching a lot of new listeners now. And on top of that, I found that whole story incredibly fascinating because we think of the automobile as an American invention, if there ever was one, and we think of ourselves as being on the cutting edge of their development, even now with electric vehicles and Tesla. So for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with this story, just are we not dominating electric vehicles anymore? What's going on?
You know, I'll be happy to do it. But the most important thing about it is that interested, intelligent, thoughtful people like your audience and like you don't know it. That ought to worry you. Okay, here it is. 15 years ago, the automobile industry began a competition. Who could come up with the best electric vehicle? Because it was understood and generally viewed that's the future of the automobile industry. We are in a transition for ecological reasons and cost reasons, blah, blah, blah. We're moving away from fossil fuels that make our cars run, gasoline, and we're going to go to electric. Okay. That was a consensus. Why? Because there were very few voices, but very few voices, which were drowned out in the United States, pushed aside, the way these folks usually are, which said that this was fundamentally irrational, that what the country needs is mass transit. Why? Because the individual vehicle is a ridiculous way of organizing transportation. Most cars spend most of every day sitting somewhere. This is nuts. What are you doing? Yeah, it's in your garage, it's in the street, it's in the parking facility. What are you doing? So that for 20 minutes a day, or maybe even an hour a day, you're actually in there. But the rest of the thing sits there. What? You can even see the understanding carefully that we now have bicycles here in New York City. Loads of them all over. Every few blocks there's a bunch of them. And when you need a bicycle, you get a bicycle. You pull it out, it's automated, you drive around and you stick it back in one of the holders, and that way a terribly amount of waste is avoided. We're not building millions of bicycles because we don't need millions. Millions of people want a bicycle, we'll provide it. 20,000 will do it very nicely because I'll take it for the hour I need it and put it back in, and John will come, and then Mary will come, and we'll share. We have a mass transit system for bicycles. Just like we have here in New York City, a subway is a fantastic invention. It takes many more people at an infinitely lower cost. Nobody gets injured once in a blue moon by a subway. No, it's just, it doesn't pollute. It's infinitely better to do mass transit. Do it beautifully. Do it elegantly. People say to me, well, what would that mean? I say, go to Europe to get on a train. Go to Tokyo. I'm familiar with Europe. The trains are magnificent. Not even the super fast ones, Why the United States is so far behind, we'll leave aside, although fast. Anyway, 15 years ago, we're going to do the electric car. Stupid, because you're replacing the private car with another private car, but at least better than fossil fuel, it'll be electricity run. Okay, Tesla is one of the early pioneers and makes Mr. Elon Musk a household name and rich, very rich. But General Motors works on it, Ford works on it, Toyota works on it, everybody works on it. But here we are now, 15 years later. The Chinese have automobile companies. They work on it too. But they win. They win the competition. The best car, best electric car and truck, at the lowest price, is made by the BYD Corporation. Precisely unknown in the United States for a simple reason. They're not permitted to come here. If you go to Europe today and you go on the highways, you'll see BYD vehicles all over the place. Why? Mr. Biden, first Mr. Trump put a 27% tariff on electric vehicles from China. And then Mr. Biden, while he was still president, raised it to 100%. So if you want to get a BYD electric car, say it costs $30,000. If you're an American company or an American individual, you would have to come up with 30 grand that goes to China to buy the car. And then 100%, another 30 grand that goes to Uncle Sam as a tariff, costing you $60,000. What does this mean? It means that Americans won't buy the Chinese car because it's 60 grand, and they can get for 45 or 50,000 a Tesla or a GM. This is a tariff that protects Tesla and GM. Well, that's why it's there. But it denies to the American people access to the best electric vehicle at the lowest price. And now let me explain very briefly why that is stupid. Okay? American companies compete with companies in the rest of the world. American companies that make shoes, if there are any left, American companies that make anything. They need trucks, for example. They need a truck to bring the inputs to wherever they carry out production, and they need trucks to take the output to wherever it's sold, right? So trucks are widely used input here in America by American companies and everywhere else in the world. But everywhere else in the world is now going to be able to get the best quality electric truck for $30,000, whereas their American competitor could only get the best electric truck if they paid $60,000, which they won't. They'll buy an inferior truck and still pay more than their competitor pays for the superior truck. You know what that means? American companies are going to lose the competition and eventually lay off the workers since they can't sell their products that have been too expensively produced. So you're protecting the workers at GM and Ford, but at the expense of not only many other American workers, but I can tell you as a mathematical economist, we cannot know whether the jobs we protect in the automobile industry won't be overwhelmed by the jobs we lose as a result of this tariff.